This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. And if you're looking for podcast production support, we highly recommend them. Find them at trisonic.co.uk.
We're losing the opportunity to build skills that we need for the future leaders. Where are those leaders going to come from if we keep reducing the talent entering the industry?
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. In February, the Institute for Practitioners in Advertising, or IPA, released its latest agency census. The findings were pretty grim. Employment at creative agencies fell 14.3% last year, and that's before Omnicom completed its acquisition of IPG and subsequently announced it would cut 4,000 jobs globally. New hiring dropped over 40%, and young people especially are finding this industry really hard to break into, let alone remain in. However, the census also registered continued progress in gender representation and ethnic diversity at agencies, even if pay gaps persist and geographical diversity is lacking. Lianree Robinson is the campaigning chair for Women in Advertising and Communications Leadership, or WACL. She also works as the CEO of the Marketing Academy Foundation and as a mentor for Who's Your Momma London. If that wasn't enough to keep Robinson busy, she's also begun writing a monthly column for us at the Media Leader. I wanted to ask Robinson on the show to discuss the findings of the IPA Agency Census and get a sense check of the progress the media and advertising industries have made with regard to gender and ethnicity inclusion over the years. This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Lianree Robinson, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I'm curious what brought you to a career in media and advertising in the first place.
It was an accident, don't tell anyone. So I had thought I was going to work in fashion. I was super keen. I bought so many magazines when I was a teenager and had been convinced that a job in fashion buying and model booking was for me because I had read Ms. Magazine and it sounded well good and that was just it. And kind of led me into sort of creative studies and broader fashion related roles, including a much broader fashion-related course that actually had much more around sort of marketing and how to run a business and PR and journalism and really sort of a much kind of wider understanding of the industry as a whole. And then I graduated with a very different time now, but you can imagine, and sent out a text message. And I said what I said, a text message, because that's how long ago it was, to everyone with something like a really cheesy line, something like, do you know anyone who needs a bright young thing like me? To pretty much anyone in my phone. And someone responded and said, yeah, call me tomorrow. And that was what led me to my first role, which was in an independent creative agency, sort of coming in as a junior project manager.
Wow. The benefits of good networking right there.
Well, it did teach me a very early lesson in networking, right? I mean, I wouldn't say that text message was possibly the best approach, but it worked, right? It worked.
Speaking of networking, I mean, you're well networked. You're a part of WACL. You're also a mentor yourself to a number of people in the industry. How did you get involved in, I guess, both of those sort of roles, and what motivated you to, I suppose, give back in that way?
Yeah, I've been a mentor for years, actually. I spent a large part of my career in a business that was it used to be described back in the day, sort of part youth club, part marketing agency, but essentially was working directly with youth audiences to create content campaigns for brilliant brands. And that meant that we had both junior team who I would develop and work with, but also a real kind of range of young talent coming through the business. So there was a lot of ad hoc mentoring that I probably didn't even call mentoring that used to happen and be asked for advice. And I would talk to people, and I love people. So it's always really good to kind of hopefully share something that you've learned that can be valuable and help someone along the way. That led me to kind of more formal mentoring, particularly for young women in the industry. So partnering with organisations like She Says to kind of do their mentoring programs. But I think, it's really important to be visible as a woman, as a Black woman in the industry. There weren't many people who looked like me when I was coming through. I'm pleased to say there are more now, obviously, much more. But I think it's important to have kind of opportunities to see people who may be coming from similar backgrounds, to be able to kind of ask conversations, to have early networks. And I wanted to be part of that change, really, and that's kind of what led me into mentoring. And similarly, what led me into the opportunity for WACL, because, like, as I said, I'm a really big believer in women. I've been mentoring for quite a while, and I think when the opportunity to join arose, it felt like it really aligned with everything that I had been doing naturally. It really fit with my belief in gender equality and the benefit for all of us in the industry. It kind of spoke to my sort of inner and outer warrior in terms of like being the change, and being able to kind of actively move things forward. And what a brilliant opportunity to connect with like amazing women in the industry. Like, who wouldn't want that?
Mm. Well, we're speaking about a week or so since the IPA released its annual agency census, and it sort of gives a view into a lot of the issues that actually you work on and care about deeply. And so before we get into any specific details of the report, I was curious if you had a look, was there anything about the state of working practice at agencies over the past year that sort of stood out to you? And keep in mind, of course, that you are not currently working at an agency anymore.
No, absolutely. I think, we might dive into some of this more detailed later, but I think it was tough to see some of those numbers on paper, right? Because even though anecdotally we have felt the kind of flux in the industry and the change, both personally and professionally, even though I'm not in, agency world now, I still have lots of friends, contacts who are, and we work with agencies and partners. So I think, seeing a sort of 14% up reduction in roles is a real, really hits home when you kind of see that number, right? That's high. That is a real impact when we think about the value that this industry brings. And I think that my main takeout when I was looking at it is that we're still in a really big period of change. Like it hasn't stopped. So I think we are probably going to still see much more, hopefully in the shape of progress, but also, there might be some opportunities where, things do go backwards because we're still in the era of mergers and restructures that haven't quite left us yet, right? So I think it will be interesting to see what those numbers look like a year on when a lot of that has settled and the announced changes have been made.
So you sort of referenced the top line there, which was that there was a 14.3% decline in employment. That's specific to creative agencies, at agencies, including media agencies, which actually added a couple jobs. The overall decline in employment among agencies was 6.8%. What do you sort of hinted at it there. What do you think caused that correction in the labor market? We're essentially at pandemic levels now, after a bit of a hiring spree post-pandemic. Is it down to consolidation among agency groups? Is there something else? Could it be AI? I'm just sort of curious how you're viewing the labor market.
I think a bit of all of the above, right? There is still, as I said earlier, like a massive consolidation happening. There are, and it's happening at all different levels. Agency groups, independents being, bought and brought into larger groups, or collaborating and merging themselves. So I think the shape of the industry has just been changing quite consistently for the last few years post-pandemic. So that's always going to have an effect on what that means for roles at kind of the industry level, the business level rather. I think also the adoption of technology has been really, really wide in the last couple of years. So AI is not new, and we know that, but in terms of how that's being brought into business over the last few years, it's kind of massively spiked. And we're now seeing some of the impact that has in terms of businesses maybe finding ways that are potentially faster and easier to deliver work, especially against a landscape of, some hard times to kind of to make money in.
Is there a reason, especially with the hard times to make money, is there a reason why it's maybe harder for creative agencies than the media side? Is the money sort of flowing more toward media agencies as opposed to creative, or is creative maybe embracing AI tools a little bit faster? I'm sort of curious what you make of the huge discrepancy between creative agency employment and media agency employment.
I would question whether I'm the best person to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah. So because I have theories, but would I be able to say that they are real in practice? I wouldn't, because I'm not in like a big creative agency now. My view, and it would be interesting to hear others, would be that I think the adoption of AI and different types of technology in the creative space has probably had a bigger impact in roles. So if we think about kind of generative AI, has probably had a bigger impact on roles in the short term, maybe than it has done in media agencies. And maybe that's why we're seeing that discrepancy. But yeah, I'd genuinely love to hear from people in creative and media agencies about where they're seeing that difference.
We'll do some reporting on that and get back to you. Something that stood out to me from the census was one of the cohorts that saw its employment prospects cut the most are those under the age of 25, some people that you may otherwise have been mentoring. The proportion of agency employees under the age of 25 fell by 19.2% year on year. Now just 11.8% of agency employees are under the age of 25, down from 17.4% just 3 years ago. And just a couple of other figures that are relevant. Graduate recruitment fell from 56% in 2024 to 43.4%. There's also been a 40.8% year-on-year decline in open roles across all levels of seniority. So not just young talent, that obviously affects a lot of sort of entry-level roles as well. I'm curious, as a mentor, you speak to younger people in the industry all the time. What are they telling you about how they feel about their career prospects, given all of this?
Yeah, you know what? It's really hard out there. One of the things, so in my role as CEO of the Marketing Academy Foundation, we support young people from low-income backgrounds to enter and start their careers in the marketing industry. So we very much focus on helping them through that application process and identifying roles and being the one that's chosen. I think the market has probably never felt tougher for that earlier cohort, and because they are at that early stage in their career, they don't have the resilience that maybe some of us have as you kind of build up and over the years and kind of might hear a few no's or can, not be successful in roles. So I think, yeah, it's definitely really, really tough. I think that having less than 20% under 25s was a stat that kind of really stood out to me, because I think back personally to lots of roles I've been in where I was like the oldest person in the business at like 32. So that feels like a really stark change for the industry. And I think there's a couple of things that have been coming through quite a lot in terms of themes. So, entry level not really being entry level anymore, not being able to deliver on that. So, because of the kind of contractions that a lot of businesses are seeing and just the challenges, everything needs to work much harder, which obviously we understand. But it in turn affects two things, right? Both the headcount budgets and that spend needing to deliver faster results than potentially an entry-level person who needs to be trained up. But then secondly, just a lack of time available to nurture young talent when teams are stretched. So we're seeing it kind of coming from multiple different angles, which, presents a real risk for the industry, and not in a distant future kind of way, like this might affect us, right? This is like, we're really risking kind of hollowing ourselves out in like under one generation, right? Because we're starting to lose the type of work that used to fill those junior roles, so they're not existing. So we're losing the opportunity to build skills that we need for the future leaders. Where are those leaders going to come from if we keep reducing the talent entering the industry?
Yeah, is that a long-term or a short-term implication? Do you see, just fast forwarding 5 years ahead, someone who otherwise would have been under 25, maybe now they're stepping up into that next big role. Is that an immediate concern that agencies should be considering and trying, more recruitment drives, some types of other things like that?
Yeah, I think it's a short and a long-term thing. So in the short term, having less people that we're training means that we're going to have a massive gap in that sort of junior manager level in the next few years, because there's a significant reduction in the amount of them that are coming in. And we're going to end up in a position where we're either trying to hold people into lower positions because we need them to we need their expertise to span a much kind of wider space than before, right? Because there's not enough experience coming up underneath them. So I think it is a short term. And then in the longer term, if we sort of look at sort of 20 years, if we're reducing at the rate that we are, the entry level talent, if I was the oldest person in the business at like 32 at one point, what's it going to look like in 20 years, right? And we're missing that magic of, the intergenerational learning, right? Because I've learned, and I think we all have had that, brilliant things from being in business with talent who have got significantly more years in the game than you have experience in all different ways, right? So the opportunity to learn from, for a young person entering the business, right, to learn from them is amazing. But if we're not even getting that, and we're also not getting the opportunity to go vice versa, because a lot of this talent AI isn't new to them, right? Technology isn't new to them. They've been growing up with that. So even when some of the advancements might be feeling fast for some of kind of more seasoned people in the industry, there's value in having talent who can help bring that adoption through and support and be really confident and competent in using that, right? So I think there's a kind of double miss that we're worrying about that affects both the short term and the long term of the industry.
I think it's really interesting, just to add, most of the marketers I speak with and people at media agencies as well, so much of their concern is spent with how do I reach Gen Z, or how do I reach Gen Alpha as it ages into that sort of 16 to 34 bracket. And if you're not hiring people of that cohort, I think you're going to have a much harder time reaching those people or understanding how to talk to them, even from a creative perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. How do we reach them? Hire them. engage with them, involve them. And look, I think, it's definitely sometimes easier said than done. And I'll be fair about that. Like I said at the beginning of this, the industry is changing rapidly. And I think it's very hard for sometimes even the best of intentions to translate into action. But that's kind of the reason why we have to double down and we have to keep moving forward, because it's taken us a really long time to see some of the shifts that are positive and that have come out of, the IPA census, but it won't take that long to kind of go spiraling back if we don't keep moving forward. So
I'll mention the positive shifts in just a second.
Good, let's do some positive.
First, just staying on young people for just one more moment. Is this an industry that still interests young people in the way that it may have 20, 30, 40 years ago? Or is it a case of the pay is insufficient, the work isn't supportive, business interests that maybe a lot of graduates aren't that interested in supporting? Maybe advertising isn't that sexy. The consumer experience of advertising has changed as well, and maybe people are less interested in making a TV ad as they might be making, a programmatic advertisement. So does that weigh in conversation at all when you're talking to people that are sort of getting into the industry?
I think the industry still has real appeal for that generation, which is great and good for us, because we wouldn't want them to not be interested. But I think that there are different lenses that they'll now take on that. So I think, your point around is it still as exciting to make a TV ad, right? There's obviously been a massive rise in terms of social content influencer partnerships, and that's a world that they really understand, and they see value and currency and are able to immediately get and add value to. Quite a lot of them are creators in their own right. And so there's a real interest and hunger and appetite for that space, I would say, over some of our kind of broader traditional forms of marketing and advertising. Interestingly, I've seen a lot more kind of growth and interest around some of the more technical sides of media. I think there's a real understanding that those are areas that are growing and developing, and that marketing and technology has continued to converge over the last few years. So that's a real opportunity space. And I think a lot of the talent that we work with are seeing that as an opportunity, and maybe somewhere that they might be able to get into, might learn something like genuinely fundamentally new, right? And build specialisms. So I think there's just kind of really different lenses. And then I'd probably say from a kind of less appealing point of view, they've definitely seen from, maybe parents or friends or wherever, the kind of real sort of burnout culture that pervaded our earlier years, and they don't want that. So that's not appealing. And I think they're kind of really looking to see how they can build good, sustainable careers, but more on their own sort of terms.
Don't burn them out. Probably need to provide them a livable wage, given that most people are living in London, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
So the positives from the IPA census, mostly to do with gender representation and ethnic diversity. Women now hold more than 40% of C-suite roles at agencies. That's a first. Also, for the first time, more than a quarter of agency employees identified as non-white, with representation particularly high, between 36 and 45% at the entry level. There are some caveats. C-suite is markedly less ethnically diverse. Just 12.7% come from non-white backgrounds at C-suite, which sort of strikes me as progress, but relatively slow progress. We've sort of seen this over the past maybe 20 years movement in the right direction, but I'm curious how you feel about it.
I think it's exactly what you said, progress, but quite relatively slow progress. So it is really good to see some of the progress that's been made, right? Having C-suite representation for women be over 40% for the first time is phenomenal, and definitely should be applauded in terms of the industry's shift and movement in that direction. So I think that, when I saw that was good news, right? And we should definitely not lose sight of that. But as you mentioned, like it's, some of these things have been growing steadily after years of focus, but we're currently in a climate of quite massive DEI rollbacks, industry uncertainty. So I think there's kind of a real risk that we could see things going backwards if we don't keep focused. And, I wrote a column recently about that. Now's not the time to slow down, right? We haven't done it all. We haven't solved it, right? And remembering that the value that this is about is not just gender equality is good because we're making sure that women have an opportunity to kind of fulfill their potential, but gender balanced businesses outperform non-gender balanced ones. We've seen that in studies from people like BlackRock. There is a real value to a industry that's having turmoil to invest in gender equality. So I think it's always about kind of reminding ourselves, how do we keep that progress moving forward, and how do we remember what value will come off the back of it as well, so that we're seeing the overall impact for the industry. And I think when it comes to sort of the progress around ethnic diversity, again, really, really pleased to see that focus. But when you sort of dive in and see that like this is kind of up sort of more than 4 times the level recorded in 2007 really struck me, right? And that's been really since we've seen the real efforts around DE&I, where businesses are put in programs, where certain targets have been set in terms of ambitions, like where we have been vocal and active as an industry about literally changing the face of our industry and making sure that it was representative of the people that we are serving, as marketers. So it's been really great to see that. But in both of them, when we look at gender and also when we look at broader diversity, it's the funnel problem that we really need to think about. So lots of people are coming in, but we're seeing that funnel really, really thinning out as we start building seniority. So, as you pointed out, we've got a lot of young people coming in to the industry from non-white backgrounds, but actually when you get up to C-suite, there's still a disparity. And it's similar to women. We are still underrepresented at C-suite compared to our incidents in the industry. So we've really still got a funnel problem that we need to sort out.
You mentioned the pushback on or rollback to DEI initiatives. I'm curious, has there been any resistance to that, loud resistance to that? Because I don't think it's not necessarily something that we have seen from certain levels of business leadership over the past year and a half, really openly fighting and saying, you know what, we really still want to be the loud and proud champion of DEI, even though you might be still championing it internally.
We've definitely seen much more sort of, I suppose, across the pond, loud and proud, very clear rollbacks, policies and processes being removed. But the impact is definitely being felt here. And, I talk to lots of different people in the industry, and lots of D&I leaders speak about it quite openly in terms of, I suppose, the changing tides over the last year and a half in particular. I think what's been a real challenge is that actually it's been harder for businesses and advocates who've been able to make that change to keep momentum around it. And you need kind of entrepreneurs, you need people who are going to drive it and keep moving it forward. And I think that has become a lot harder in this landscape, because to some of my earlier points, trying to do more with less, having kind of quite constant changing landscapes, both on a agency perspective, from a brand perspective. So all of those things, I think, are like compounding the issues that we've got.
Yeah, in some ways, the numbers hide the amount of real work that had to be done in order for those numbers to get where they are today.
Exactly.
And it's easy to take that for granted as a new status quo when it might start moving in the opposite direction unless you keep your foot on the pedal. Something that did not progress as much, however, is the gender and ethnic pay gaps. There remains a 19.5% gender pay gap and a 19.4% ethnicity pay gap, although the ethnicity pay gap shrunk substantially year on year. Can you tell me at all what might explain that? Is it the funnel issue where C-suites remunerated at a higher level and therefore they would earn more and there's just fewer women and people from diverse ethnic backgrounds in C-suite, or is there actually something more to it than that?
Again, like anything where there's sort of systemic change needed, it's never just one thing that's going to move the needle. And what you can see is, you just touched on it, one of the challenges there around the funnel means that the reality of having, underrepresentation at that senior level, compared to the incidence, means that there will be a gap. I think particularly when it comes to the gender pay gap, one of the key drivers is that lack of flexibility and flexible working that disproportionately affects women in business, due to just a higher level for the burden of care, whether that be for children or parents, tending to fall on women, which then in turn affects career advancement, which then in turn affects pay opportunities, with a lot of women actually kind of leaving the industry because of that sort of catch-22 that they're finding themselves in. Some businesses are still seeing flexibility as a perk rather than a benefit that allows women and actually all of your team to kind of operate at their best level, right? Because if they're able to do work in the way that works best for them, you're going to get the best out of them. So I think there's, a multitude of challenges around that. But yeah, when it comes to the gender pay gap, I think the lack of flexibility is one of those real challenges.
Also the rollback in flexibility. I mean, just a few years ago, it seemed like you could come into the office, you could work from home. Obviously, during COVID, everyone was working from home. But then there's been a push further and further into you need to be back in the office without maybe consideration for how it impacts different types of employees.
Exactly. And again, that's a real narrowing kind of point, right? Because suddenly it's 3 days back in the office. So if you are a woman or someone who does have more of the burden of care within a family context, that has immediately changed the viability of working for you. Or, and I think not only like when you see things like Pregnant and Screwed and WACL, we talk a huge amount about the impact of women's health, women having much more complex health needs across the life cycle of their working lives, right? Everything from periods, menstruation, right through to like pregnancy, maternity, fertility, right through to menopause, and then all of the other things that can affect us in terms of our working lives. There's a lot of capacity there for challenge, and I think that the businesses really need to lean into that, because we're losing brilliant talent because we don't have policies and processes in place to support those kind of life stages. So I think, yeah, it's a real challenge, but these things all together are what kind of keep the gender pay gap persisting.
What are some of WACL's key priorities for this year and maybe into the next 18 to 24 months as well?
I'll give you a full strategy.
Okay. I'm interested.
Yeah. So WACL's mission is to accelerate gender equality in the industry for the good of us all. Last year we launched a campaign called Change the Stats, which was really highlighting the 5 levers of change, which is some research that we did a couple of years ago, identifying what it was that was actually the blockers to gender equality and what some of the strategies and approaches would be in order to kind of remove those and move the industry forward. So the campaign was very much focused on highlighting each of those 5 levers. I've mentioned some of them around flexible working, around women's health, around what leadership looks like. So changing the language of leadership is another one that actually is really important for our industry. And how we move those forward. We'll be bringing Change the Stats back, which will be great soon in this year. But really, we're driving a lot of conversations and industry advocacy about how do we move to that place? How do we bring male allies into the conversation? And how do we make it practical and easy for businesses to make change, because we really recognise that this is a challenging context for everyone to be operating in. So, our role is to really support the industry in being able to make change. Alongside the campaign, we launched a toolkit that really kind of broke down those 5 levers, helped shape suggested approaches, strategies, policies, content that would help businesses drive and build their own activities that would kind of push towards gender equality. So really trying to work with the industry across this year and beyond to make that change and find ways to showcase all of the great things that happen when we're getting there, right? We see a lot of brilliant things that are happening with non-gendered styles of leadership and businesses that are, that are leading, whether that's a woman at the top or whether it's non-traditional or less gendered style of leadership that's kind of pervading. So yeah, I think big focus around that will be coming through, and how do we kind of showcase the possible future on the other side that we can all benefit from.
How would you describe the mood among WACL members without necessarily calling anyone out? What's the overall sense you get at the moment, at this point in time, from them?
I think the mood is that there's still work to be done. We're definitely, and not to speak for all WACL members, but I think we're definitely want to celebrate where the wins are being made and the progress is being made. So like we said earlier, some of the stats were really kind of positive to see. But we can't stop now. We still need to move towards that. Our ambition is that we want to see 50% of CEOs to be women in the industry. So it's really great to see these numbers sort of hitting over 40 for the first time ever. So it's really important that we actually keep pushing forward and make sure that we get towards that, rather than kind of taking our foot off the pedal and seeing ourselves sort of slide backwards amongst all of the kind of changing circumstances. So yeah, I'd say the mood is like work to be done.
Well, we like a motivated group. Last point on the IPA census, something that stuck out to me, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier around the cost of living, especially in London. 4/5 of agency employees are located in London, compared to 16% in the rest of England and just 2% in Scotland. I don't even think Wales made the cut in the IPA census.
Poor Wales.
Is the industry limiting its talent pool, whether it's women, whether it's a more diverse background ethnically or otherwise, by having almost everyone work in the most expensive part of the country, especially if at entry level for relatively meager pay?
I think this is a real challenge, actually, because we know that there are some agencies and brands, obviously, that are super successful outside of London and have kind of big teams and marketing businesses. But the vast majority of opportunities are still here. And those opportunities are tighter at the moment as well, right? So not only do we have kind of talent looking for roles, but we now have talent from all over the country looking for roles, in a smaller pool. I like to think of it, instead of kind of thinking like, what do we lose by not having sort of hybrid working? I think like, what do we gain, right? What talent are we missing out on because of the fact that we're less flexible, that we're not looking outside of different locations, that we've maybe rolled back our support for hybrid working? Like, what brilliant talent might have been forced out of the industry because of circumstance that could now be regained to everyone's benefit? So I think that's something that I would, hope that we can urge the industry to see, like, what opportunities can be opened up by having a more kind of flexible approach and potentially, geographically as well.
So before we end, I want to ask you a little bit about your new column for us at the Media Leader. For those of you listening out there who haven't already seen, Lianre, you are writing a monthly piece for us. Can you tell us a little bit about what topics you'll be looking to highlight and explore maybe next month or at least in the near future?
Yeah, I'll be talking about all the things I'm super passionate about. I really enjoyed getting my first column out, so looking forward to the rest of them. Social mobility in our industry, we've touched on that a bit now. The opportunities for business and young talent, gender equality and how we get there. So really practical, hopefully helpful conversations that can kind of move the needle and push us forward. Brilliant stories of women and women's talent, and also things that I just find interesting about our media and marketing world. So it might be kind of reflections on work or things that are happening in the industry, but probably those sort of places. But I hope people enjoyed the last column and will want to read some more.
Well, I will certainly be reading Lianree. It's been a total pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader Podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, TriSonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.